When I first saw her standing in my garage, my private sanctuary, flicking through my toolbox and muttering under her breath about HOA standards, I nearly lost the ability to speak. Imagine waking up early, grabbing a cup of coffee with half-lidded eyes, only to discover a person you've never granted permission to rummaging through your belongings. That morning I froze in the doorway. My name is Ethan Chambers, and I had no clue my new life in this upscale suburban development would spiral into such a bizarre confrontation with a homeowners association. I also didn't expect that the woman violating my property, wearing a pristine beige blazer, hair sprayed into a silver helmet, would soon come to realize I'm actually the city's police chief. Yet there she was, rummaging around, snapping photos with her phone, and muttering about how my cluttered space ruined the community aesthetics. If you think that's extreme, wait until you hear the rest. Because in the next few seconds, she turned to me, gave a dismissive wave, and demanded I step aside. She claimed she had every right to be there. It left me so stunned I initially wondered if I was still half dreaming. Allow me to rewind just a bit. Not too far, though. I'll be direct. I moved into Springwood Groves 2 months ago, seeking a quiet place to rebuild my life after my recent divorce. I'm 42, a father to 2 middle schoolers who mostly live with their mother but visit me on weekends. My professional life has always been anchored in law enforcement. Recently, I was appointed police chief in this mid-sized city, a promotion that came with certain perks but also enormous responsibilities. After years spent in a cramped apartment near the station, I'd saved enough to purchase a decent home in a neighborhood that had a reputation for serenity and a strong community spirit. That's what the brochure claimed. Ironically, it never mentioned the homeowners association's near tyrannical reign. I should have suspected something was off when my realtor whispered, "Everyone says the HOA here is intense, but the landscaping's gorgeous, right?" She pointed to the manicured lawns and uniform fences as if it justified everything. At the time, I thought, how bad could it be? The property was well within my price range. The house itself was a handsome 2-story with a wraparound porch, an attached garage, and a neat backyard. My kids loved the place, so we pressed forward. I signed the usual thick stack of closing documents, acknowledging the presence of the HOA, and that was that. Or so I believed. My first inkling of trouble arrived about a week after I settled in. I discovered a note pinned to my front door. Important HOA noticed, stating that my refuse bins had been placed incorrectly, a violation of Section 14.3 that mandated bins be stored out of public sight except on designated pickup days. That seemed inconsequential. I shrugged and moved the bins behind the side gate. 2 days later, I received a second notice chiding me for unauthorized basketball hoop placement in the driveway. That basketball hoop was a gift for my son's birthday. I'd set it up to encourage him to practice on weekends. The letter threatened a $50 fine if it wasn't removed within 72 hours. I didn't have the time to fight back just yet. The transition to my new role as police chief was absorbing most of my energy. The city was dealing with an uptick in property crimes, a swirling rumor of police corruption under the previous administration, and a stack of pending departmental reforms I had to sign off on. So I complied, albeit reluctantly, telling myself I'd figure out a compromise later. It's when I first encountered the mysterious woman many called Karen. Her real name, as I would soon learn, was Dorothy Monroe. She was around her early 60s, with a crisp voice that somehow suggested both civility and condemnation in one breath. She wore pastel suits, made a habit of wandering around with a clipboard, and introduced herself as the president of the Springwood Groves HOA. The day I met her on my driveway, she stood in the middle of my property, surveying the area as though she were a monarch inspecting her domain. "You must be Mr. Chambers," she said, offering a perfunctory smile. "I'm Dorothy Monroe, but everyone just calls me Dottie. "I head the HOA here. We like to maintain a certain standard." She proceeded to hand me a stack of papers, each page detailing some regulation, some about lawn height, some about paint colors, even a few specifying which brand of mailbox was permissible. I recall flipping through the packet, noticing entire sections devoted to the most trivial issues: the acceptable shape of flower beds, the required spacing of garbage bins, the ban on certain garden gnomes deemed inconsistent with neighborhood aesthetics. It was overwhelming. During that first meeting, I only responded with polite nods. I'd learned from years in law enforcement that direct confrontation rarely yields good outcomes on day one. Let people talk. Let them reveal themselves, their angle, their methods. Dottie gave me her phone number, told me to call if I had any questions, and said, "We hope you'll be an active member of our wonderful community. We really are a family here." The word family sounded false. Somehow, I sensed that behind her courteous facade lay a drive for absolute control over her neighbors. I didn't realize just how deep her influence went. I found out in bits and pieces from small talk with other residents. People were terrified to cross her. Fast forward a few weeks, I'd accumulated a handful of violation notices. Each time I found them, I complied if it was easy to do so. Yet the demands escalated in pettiness and thoroughness. One notice claimed my front window blinds were the wrong shade of white, referencing a color code that apparently matched a local paint brand. Another claimed I'd failed to submit a formal request for planting daisies in my front yard. Daisies! I was baffled but also annoyed. Who writes up daisies for code infractions? The strangest part was that all these notices were signed by Dottie Monroe, and they included language that threatened fines and penalties. Meanwhile, I had bigger fish to fry at work. The city's budget hearings were in progress, and as chief, I had to advocate for departmental resources. I was also investigating the leftover mess from the previous police chief's questionable alliances with certain real estate developers. Some rumor hinted at backroom deals allowing them to sidestep environmental constraints. Part of my duty was to ensure transparency, so I'd begun auditing old case files. That's when I discovered a curious pattern. A property development project near Springwood Groves that had been stalled multiple times due to alleged environmental concerns, wetland protection specifically. The timing was interesting. The developer had contributed to the re-election campaign of certain city council members, yet the project never fully died. I filed away the info, uncertain it would matter to me personally, but something in my gut told me this might link back to the neighborhood eventually. Then came the morning I caught Dottie in my garage. I'd stepped out around 7 a.m. to grab the local paper, an old habit, only to notice my side door slightly ajar. That door was always locked. Instinct set in. I moved quietly along the side of my house, hearing muffled footsteps inside. My immediate suspicion was a break-in. My pulse kicked up a notch, and I mentally ran through the protocol. Call for backup. Secure the perimeter. But then I heard a voice exclaim, "What a mess! Violations everywhere." That voice was distinctly female and somehow vaguely familiar. With caution, I eased open the door the rest of the way. And there she was, Dorothy, Dottie Monroe, rummaging through boxes that I hadn't even unpacked yet. She had her phone out, snapping pictures of what appeared to be old car parts, some paint cans, and a few dusty holiday decorations. My first reaction was pure shock. "Excuse me," I finally said, my voice echoing off the garage walls. She jumped nearly a foot in the air, dropping her phone momentarily. Then she whirled around, eyes blazing with a look that combined anger and self-righteous indignation. "Mr. Chambers, you startled me, but as HOA President, I have the right, nay, the obligation, to verify that your storage area meets neighborhood guidelines." She pointed a finger at me. "You left the door open, so I had cause to inspect. These items are definitely in violation. Hazardous materials, unapproved shelving, Clutter that can be visible from the outside if you open your garage door. It's all right here. I have the photographic evidence. I was speechless for a moment. The nerve of this woman. She had effectively broken into my property. No part of the HOA regulations, at least none I'd read, granted them permission to invade a homeowner's locked garage. I took a deep breath. Years of training told me to stay calm, gather facts. Dottie, you do realize this is trespassing. You have no legal authority to come inside my garage. Trespassing? Absolutely not. The HOA charter allows me to investigate health or safety concerns. She tried to wave me off again, telling me that if I had any issues, I should file an appeal with the board. Now, in the average scenario, a homeowner might be intimidated or uncertain about legal boundaries. I, on the other hand, had the entire city's legal framework in my mental library, plus I literally oversee the police force that enforces trespassing laws. So I took another breath, forcing calmness into my tone. You have 5 seconds to step outside this garage and hand over your phone so we can delete those pictures, or else I'll have you charged. She stared at me, stunned by my sudden shift in demeanor. Charged? Don't be ridiculous. I'm the HOA president, and who are you to threaten me? That's the moment my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from my deputy at the station, letting me know we had a city council meeting in 2 hours. It reminded me of my official capacity, and I realized maybe it was time to let her know exactly who she was messing with. I locked eyes with her, paused for a second, and said, "I'm the newly appointed chief of police. Now get out." That sentence, that single sentence changed everything. She froze, face draining of color. I watched her mouth open, then close, like a fish gasping for air. For once, her words failed her. She tried a comeback, something along the lines of, "The HOA board will hear of this," but her voice quivered. I gestured for her to step outside, and she complied hesitantly. She clutched her phone, refusing to hand it over. At that moment, though I was furious, I opted not to forcibly take it. I was confident enough in the security cameras installed at my property. I had footage of her strolling in through that side door, footage that would confirm her unauthorized entry. Once outside, she sputtered about how she was acting in the neighborhood's best interest. I told her I'd be filing a complaint. She stomped away in a fury, nearly tripping on the garden hose by my driveway. For the next few days, my mind oscillated between anger and amusement. I replayed that confrontation over and over. On one hand, it was brazen trespassing. On the other, it was downright comical that this woman believed she had more authority than an actual police officer, let alone the department's chief. But it wasn't a small matter. The principle of personal rights was paramount to me. If she felt justified intruding into my garage, what else was she capable of doing to other residents who might feel powerless to stand up to her? But that wasn't even the end of it. That weekend, my kids came over. My daughter Layla commented that a neighbor was watching them from across the street while they were practicing with the basketball hoop I'd moved to the backyard. My son Tyler said the same woman was taking photos. I went to investigate but found no one in sight. A single car drove off as soon as I stepped outside. I started to suspect Dottie might be gathering more evidence. Part of me wanted to just bring down the legal hammer immediately, but another side wanted to see how far she'd go. So I waited. I installed additional security cameras, not just on the garage door, but around the perimeter of the house. My position as police chief gave me access to certain resources, but I didn't want to use them in a way that could be considered an abuse of power. Instead, I kept everything above board, documenting every attempt she made to harass or trespass. The legal lines were clear. If she stepped foot into my property again without permission, that would be a clear-cut case for trespassing charge. I also discovered that she had a circle of loyal board members in the HOA. Whenever I passed through the neighborhood in my unmarked sedan, I would see at least 2 or 3 individuals giving me sideways looks or scribbling in notepads. It felt like a small surveillance state. People often associate HOAs with petty fines and overly strict landscaping rules, but from what I was seeing, these folks took it to another level. It was as though their entire purpose was to ferret out micro-infractions. During this period, I began receiving an unusually high volume of anonymous complaints at the station about my property. It was borderline comical. Accusations of unregulated noise, light pollution, and even unauthorized gatherings. Since I was the chief, every complaint had to be processed. But my colleagues quickly learned these were bogus attempts to paint me as a serial violator. Eventually, they started rolling their eyes whenever a new one came in, but the wasted resources bothered me. The city had real issues: gang activity in certain neighborhoods, burglary rings, an uptick in drug incidents, yet we were stuck fielding nonsense calls about how my porch light was allegedly angled incorrectly. One evening, I received a phone call from a local city council member, Robert Hensley, who was known to be friendly with the HOAs in multiple developments. He said something along the lines of, "Chief Chambers, I've heard you're having issues in Springwood Groves. It's a delicate community. Perhaps you should try to keep a lower profile. We wouldn't want your presence to disrupt their peace." I read between the lines. This was a gentle warning, or maybe a threat. I politely reminded him that no one, not even a council member or an HOA board, is above the law. He hung up soon after, offering no direct threat, but leaving a sour taste in my mouth. It was around this time I stumbled on a piece of the puzzle linking Springwood Groves and that stalled development project. According to some historical zoning documents, a portion of land right behind my neighborhood had been designated a wetland preserve. That preserve was the major sticking point preventing large-scale expansion. Guess who happened to be a driving force behind the attempt to rezone that land for development? None other than a committee that included Dorothy Monroe. She was listed as an active volunteer in favor of community growth, which I suspected was a euphemism for letting developers build oversensitive environmental areas, ignoring possible ecological harm. The more I looked into it, the more it seemed she and certain board members might have been leveraging the HOA's stringent rules to push out homeowners who opposed them. If they could systematically harass or fine certain families until they sold their homes, the developer might buy up those properties more easily, eventually controlling the majority needed to rezone or repurpose the preserve. I decided to attend the next HOA board meeting incognito, just to see how they operated. I didn't hide my identity as a resident, but I withheld the fact that I was the police chief. Though Dottie and her core group knew, they might not have told every single board member. That evening I walked into the community center. The air felt tense. A few residents nodded politely at me while others quickly looked away. The board sat at the front table in an authoritative row. Dottie was there, along with 3 older men and a woman who looked younger, possibly in her 30s. The meeting started with routine formalities, reading the minutes of the previous session, discussing a proposed upgrade to the neighborhood pool, and so on. Then the floor opened for community concerns, and boy did that escalate quickly. One neighbor stood up, complaining about an improper fence that the HOA had mandated they tear down, resulting in thousands of dollars in loss. Another said they'd been fined repeatedly for a non-approved bird bath in their front yard. A few more described how someone from the HOA had come onto their property without consent. Dottie sat there, calmly stating that the HOA had the right to enforce regulations. She cited vague clauses about protecting community standards. I noticed the younger woman on the board checking her phone frequently and occasionally whispering to Dottie. Something about that duo felt orchestrated. Maybe they were sharing updates or verifying resident addresses to keep track of who was complaining. When it was my turn, I stood. I recently experienced someone from this HOA unlawfully entering my garage, I said, carefully controlling my voice. Does the charter explicitly give board members the right to step inside a locked area without permission? Dottie cleared her throat, gave me a tight-lipped smile, and said, "We have broad authority to investigate potential hazards. Our main concern is the safety and aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood." She avoided looking me in the eye, though. I repeated, "So, you're confirming that the HOA charter allows for forced entry?" A murmur rippled through the attendees, some in disbelief, some in fear. That's when one of the older men on the board, Mr. Caldwell, leaned forward and whispered something to Dottie. She nodded, then offered a practiced response. "Of course not forced entry, but if a door's left ajar, we do have the right to check for code violations." The entire meeting soon devolved into a heated back and forth between residents and the board. People demanded specifics. The board offered vague references to subsections that nobody could find. I realized a crucial detail. Many residents were clueless about their actual legal rights. They had no idea the HOA had no real authority to intrude on locked private spaces. The meeting ended with no resolution. As I left, I overheard Dottie telling a small group of her loyal supporters that Mr. Chambers is stirring trouble. We might have to take further action. Her tone had a venomous edge. Still, I waited. I wanted something rock solid that would prove beyond a doubt she was abusing her position. My personal garage trespass might not have been enough to unseat her from the HOA presidency if she just claimed the door was open, effectively lying. I needed a scenario that left no wiggle room, no plausible deniability. Meanwhile, I had to balance my official duties. The corruption probe within the department had revealed that the previous chief had a cozy relationship with some developers. I suspected these might be the very same ones eyeing the wetlands behind Springwood Groves. The plan seemed straightforward. Intimidate or evict the resistant homeowners, eventually rezone, then build a profitable complex. The wetlands were protected, though, so that required the city's approval to bypass environmental rules. It was borderline illegal. The deeper I dug, the clearer it became that some city council members, including Robert Hensley, were financially tied to it. One morning, a neighbor named Luis approached me while I was checking my mail. He looked exhausted. "You're that new resident, right? The one who's a..." He paused, probably not wanting to say police officer too loudly. "Yes, I'm Ethan," I said. He glanced around anxiously and leaned in. "I heard you had trouble with Ms. Monroe." "Me too. She's been fining me for my backyard greenhouse, claiming it blocks a community walkway, which is nonsense. She threatened that if I keep ignoring the fines, she'll get a lien placed on my property." His voice shook with a mixture of frustration and fear. I offered him a reassuring smile, told him to keep track of everything in writing, don't pay a cent that isn't legally enforceable. The HOA can't just place a lien without a valid reason recognized by state law. He whispered thanks, looking grateful, but also unsure whether to believe that the board's powers might be limited. A couple of days later, I noticed a new sign near the neighborhood entrance. "Coming soon, Springwood Eco Residences, modern living in harmony with nature." The developer's logo was displayed prominently. More than a few residents were seething, especially those who enjoyed the forested trails behind our homes, fearing they'd be bulldozed for more cookie-cutter houses. The sign was suspiciously official-looking, with the city's crest in the corner, although I strongly doubted the city had formally approved anything yet. That gave me a reason to ask around. Most neighbors didn't know about any new development. But one older gentleman, Mr. Figueroa, told me he'd heard rumors that Dottie was on the developer's payroll. By now everything was converging. My suspicion about Dottie's meddling, her support from certain city officials, the intimidation tactics. I filed a quiet inquiry with the city records office, trying to see if the developer had any active permits. The clerk found nothing official, So that sign was likely placed there to create an illusion of inevitability, scaring residents into compliance or selling. Then came the event that blew everything up in broad daylight. It started on a Thursday afternoon. I received a frantic text from my security app indicating motion detected interior. My phone displayed a snapshot from inside my home, specifically my living room. My heart raced. My kids were not there that day, and I had no reason to expect visitors. I glimpsed in the still frame a shape that looked suspiciously like Dottie, rummaging through a kitchen drawer. She had apparently broken into my actual house this time, not just the garage. Without hesitation, I drove straight home, radioing for backup from an on-duty patrol car. When I arrived, I saw Dottie's car parked on the curb, engine running. The front door to my house was wide open. I could hear rummaging noises from inside. My training took over. I approached carefully, scanning the yard to ensure no accomplices were lurking. Then I stepped into my own foyer, jaw tightening at the thought that this woman had invaded my living space. I heard her footsteps in the hall, accompanied by faint curses as she presumably sorted through my personal files or drawers. "Freeze," I commanded, stepping around the corner. I found her at my desk, sifting through official police documents, files I had brought home for review relating to the corruption investigation. She spun around, eyes bulging with fear, phone in hand, as though she were trying to photograph the documents. "Ethan!" "Mr. Chambers, you left your door open again. I'm conducting an inspection. These papers look suspicious, possibly in violation of public safety codes." Her voice trembled, probably because she realized how ludicrous that claim was. I stared at her, my fury barely contained. "So you broke into my locked home again? This time rifling through confidential police records?" She stuttered something incomprehensible about community welfare, her face going pale. Within seconds, 2 uniformed officers arrived at my doorstep. They recognized me obviously, and then they saw Dottie with a stack of my documents. It didn't take them long to piece together the situation. "Ma'am, place your hands on your head," one officer instructed. She protested, yelling that she was an HOA president. She threatened them with legal action, but the officers had witnessed enough to take her into custody. They read her the Miranda warning. She began shrieking that this was all a misunderstanding. By then, a crowd of neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk, watching with bated breath. Some even cheered, quietly, and let the officers do their job, stepping back to avoid any appearance of bias. But my mind was racing. Dottie was caught red-handed. That alone was a big moment, but the documents she was snooping through were about the developer's questionable attempts to circumvent environmental rules. Maybe she was trying to see if I had discovered her involvement. Perhaps she feared that if I found evidence linking her to bribery or manipulation of city officials, it would land her in serious trouble, while ironically, her desperate break-in attempt sealed her fate. Later that evening, I visited the station to finalize the paperwork on her arrest. She was booked for trespassing, burglary, and, depending on the district attorney's assessment, possibly attempted theft of privileged information. As the news trickled out, more residents began filing complaints about her unauthorized entries. A pattern emerged. She'd let herself into backyards, garages, even side gates, all under the pretense of code enforcement. Some residents admitted they'd been too afraid to speak up before. The DA's office began building a strong case against her. Naturally, the HOA board went into crisis mode. The younger woman I'd seen at the meeting tried to distance herself, claiming she had no idea Dottie's tactics were so invasive. But the evidence suggested a conspiracy. Text messages revealed that certain board members actively encouraged her to gather incriminating data on residents, especially those who opposed the Eco-Residences project. The bigger shock came when City Council member Robert Hensley's name appeared in a string of emails, indicating he had coordinated with Dottie to identify problematic residents who wouldn't cooperate with the developer. As all this unraveled, The board members who weren't directly implicated called an emergency election to remove Dottie from her position. A wave of relief swept through the neighborhood. Meanwhile, from my vantage point as police chief, I handed off the conflict of interest aspects to an external investigative unit to ensure impartiality. I wanted to avoid any suggestion that I was using my power for personal gain, but I did cooperate fully, giving them every piece of footage and document I had. Public sentiment turned heavily against the entire notion of that development project. Environmental groups got wind of the story and staged protests by the wetlands, outraged that local officials might have been bribed into rezoning. Investigative journalists began digging, shining a light on the cozy deals that had been negotiated behind closed doors. Hensley faced a recall petition. The developer, under intense media scrutiny, halted all marketing campaigns for Springwood eco-residences. Meanwhile, Dottie, facing the reality of criminal charges, tried to mount a defense. She hired an attorney who attempted to argue that she'd been entrapped or that the door was conveniently unlocked. But my security footage was crystal clear. She used a small set of master keys, likely a universal lockpicking kit or a maintenance pass, that was never legally issued by the city. The footage captured her wiggling the lock open in the faint hope that no one would notice, so that door she claimed was left ajar was in fact forcibly tampered with, albeit carefully. Her explanation unraveled quickly. Eventually, in a bid to reduce her sentence, Dottie offered to turn over all correspondences she'd had with city officials and the developer. By then, her betrayal of them was a last-ditch attempt at self-preservation. The DA recommended a plea deal for trespassing, criminal mischief, and unlawful surveillance. She got probation plus hundreds of hours of community service, but more importantly, her admissions helped accelerate the corruption probe. The city council scheduled a formal inquiry, multiple resignations followed, and Hensley was indicted. Springwood Grove's HOA was forced to undergo a major overhaul. An interim president, Mrs. Charlotte Parker, a longtime resident known for her fairness, took over. She promptly reviewed the entire set of regulations, discarding the draconian rules and focusing on safety and genuine community well-being. At the next neighborhood meeting, dozens of residents showed up, sharing stories of intimidation from the previous regime. Many said they felt powerless until they realized they weren't alone. One of the most significant changes involved establishing a rule that no HOA board member could enter private property without explicit written consent, except in bona fide emergencies like an active fire or major water leak that threatened communal property. This was a direct response to Dottie's abuses. Another reform mandated complete transparency. The HOA had to post all meeting agendas and minutes online, and financial disclosures were mandatory for all board members, preventing hidden conflicts of interest. On a personal level, my life gradually returned to normal, well, as normal as one's life can be after dealing with that fiasco. My children visited on weekends without me worrying about them being photographed for imaginary violations. My neighbors, some of whom had been distant at first, started greeting me with friendly waves. A few told me they were grateful that I stood up to the tyranny of an out-of-control HOA president. I repeated what had become my mantra. You don't need to be a police officer to stand up for your rights. You just need to know the law and have the courage to use it. But the most surprising reaction came from people who'd once been part of Dottie's inner circle. A couple of them approached me and apologized, saying they felt pressured or bullied by her. They explained that she had threatened them with massive fines or property liens if they didn't support her cause. Some had participated in minor acts of surveillance or false reporting out of fear for their own homes. I accepted their apologies, reminding them that living in fear is not the definition of a functional community. As the weeks passed, the story of HOA Karen, who didn't know I was the city's police chief, spread beyond our neighborhood. Local media outlets picked it up, framing it as an example of how far some HOAs can go if left unchecked. They interviewed me for a short segment on the evening news. I tried to keep the focus on the broader lesson, that community governance is important, but it must remain transparent, fair, and bound by the same legal framework as everyone else. One sunny afternoon, a group of neighbors decided to hold a block party, a celebration of sorts to mark the end of Dottie's oppressive rule. Tables were set out with potluck dishes lined up in an array of colors and aromas. A local band played easy listening tunes, and children ran around, laughing without fear of being cited for excessive noise. Some folks joked about how we could have invited Dottie to this event if she hadn't tried to break into everyone's home. Others just enjoyed the newfound sense of freedom. A few environmental activists also joined, raising awareness of the wetlands behind our homes, ensuring we remained vigilant against future development schemes that might compromise the local ecosystem. During the party, Luis came up to me with a huge grin. "No more greenhouse fines, Mr. Chambers. I can finally grow tomatoes in peace." He handed me a small basket of fresh produce, a token of gratitude. Another neighbor, Mrs. Green, a retired teacher, told me that she and her husband were no longer planning to sell their home out of frustration. They'd decided to stay now that the community climate had improved. Those were the real triumphs, seeing people regain a sense of belonging, free from anxiety or intimidation. Meanwhile, the developer's sign quietly disappeared from the entrance of Springwood Groves. The wetlands remained untouched, and though the city's corruption scandal continued to unfold in slow motion, at least the conversation had begun. People were no longer apathetic. They realized that local politics, the interplay between HOAs, city councils, and private interests mattered tremendously. These micro-level dramas affected their day-to-day lives more than they ever imagined. In all of this, I learned a valuable personal lesson. Transparency and accountability might be tedious, but they prevent the kind of tyranny that thrives in the shadows. If I hadn't had that security system installed, if I hadn't been patient enough to gather evidence, Dottie's reign might have continued. And on a deeper, more introspective level, I realized that sometimes you land in a place where your responsibilities, your sense of duty, go beyond your job description. For me, it wasn't just about protecting my own house. It was about safeguarding an entire neighborhood from people who believed they could twist rules to suit their greed, or who felt so self-righteous they trampled on basic rights. I did, however, reflect on the question, what if I hadn't been the police chief? Would the outcome have been different? Possibly. Residents without legal expertise or official standing might have struggled more. They might have been drowned under piles of fines or forced to pay for violations they never committed. They might have left, giving up their homes. That realization made me even more determined to ensure local enforcement and legal aid were accessible to regular citizens. If a homeowner calls in to report an HOA going rogue, they shouldn't be brushed off. They should be taken seriously. Sometime later, I received a letter from Dottie, handwritten, delivered through her attorney. It was a bizarre combination of apology and justification. She claimed she believed wholeheartedly in keeping the neighborhood safe, that she felt pushed by the developer to ensure compliance, and that maybe she crossed the line. She also wrote that she never intended to break the law, but everything got out of hand. She asked if there was a chance for a reduced sentence if she provided more documents. By then, the deals were all done. She'd already cooperated for a plea bargain. She was on probation, doing community service by cleaning up litter in public parks. Ironic, given her disregard for personal property boundaries. I didn't respond. I felt it was best to let the legal system handle the rest. Perhaps she'd reflect on the consequences of arrogance and invasive tactics. Maybe she'd learn that genuine leadership in a community involves communication, respect, and consensus building, not fear and manipulation. From that point forward, The name Karen in Springwood Groves became a cautionary tale. Residents would whisper, "Don't pull a Dottie," whenever someone hinted at calling the HOA over trivial matters. The environment grew friendlier. Neighbors started volunteering for more positive initiatives, like a local reading club or neighborhood watch that actually helped reduce petty crimes. I also worked with a few board members to set up a small scholarship for local teens interested in environmental science, partly as a nod to the wetlands we fought to protect. Life became calmer, in the best way possible. On days off, I'd sit on my porch, reading or sipping coffee, greeting my neighbors as they walked their dogs or jogged by. No one glared, no one wrote me up for having the wrong shade of blinds. If I saw something amiss, a street light flickering, a pothole forming, I'd mention it in our newly established online forum, where people collaborated to find solutions rather than penalize each other. It felt like a genuine community at last, not some oppressive compound. Ultimately, if I had to pinpoint the moral of this story, I'd say it's about boundaries, both literal and metaphorical. Laws exist to keep society ordered and fair. Personal property lines exist for a reason, ensuring our privacy and comfort. When someone tries to demolish those lines under the guise of authority or for personal gain, they undermine the very structure of trust that holds neighborhoods together. That's what Dottie did. And that's why she lost every shred of credibility when we exposed her. I won't pretend everything is perfect now. The city still deals with bigger issues. Corruption doesn't vanish overnight. Some folks remain wary, having been burned by the HOA fiasco. Yet the tide has turned in Springwood Groves, thanks to the resilience and collective action of ordinary people. Plus one outraged police chief who refused to let a brazen trespass slide. If someone had told me a year ago that I'd end up in a standoff with a relentless HOA president culminating in her arrest, I would have laughed at the absurdity. But reality can be stranger than fiction, especially when power goes unchecked. Through it all, I've learned to appreciate the quiet corners of suburban life that I once considered dull or uneventful. Ironically, behind the veneer of quiet streets and pretty lawns, real drama can simmer just below the surface. And so, whenever I step into my garage now, I remember that morning when I found an uninvited presence in what should have been my private domain. I recall her brazen claims of authority, the disbelief on her face when I revealed who I truly was. I think about how that single moment peeled back the layers of corruption entwined with the HOA. Strangely enough, I find a bit of gratitude for the entire ordeal, because in exposing her, I not only protected my own rights, but also helped safeguard an entire community from an even larger scheme lurking just beyond the wetlands. That sense of purpose reaffirms why I do what I do. Maybe, in the bigger picture, it reaffirms why law enforcement matters at the local level. I still see Dottie occasionally in passing, doing her community service, picking up trash along the highway, wearing a reflective vest. She avoids eye contact, probably wrestling with whatever leftover pride she has. I don't gloat, I don't sneer, I just remind myself that no position, no label, be it HOA president or even police chief, places anyone above accountability. Because the moment we start believing our titles grant us the right to infringe on others, we've betrayed the very principle of justice. Perhaps that's the lasting lesson for anyone who hears this story. Never underestimate the power of one person standing up for what's right, and never let a self-appointed authority trample on your dignity or freedom. If you do, you might be opening the door to something far worse. Let's just say, even if you're not a cop, if your conscience tells you something is wrong, you have every right, some might say every duty, to call it out. Springwood Groves remains a lovely place, truly, with tree-lined streets and children riding bikes at dusk. I like to think it's even lovelier now that it's free from the oppressive shadow of a corrupt HOA leadership. Our lawns might not all look identical, our mailboxes might differ in style, but that's what real diversity is. People coexisting with empathy, not uniformity. The wetlands behind our homes stand untouched and teeming with wildlife, a testament to the environment we preserved by shining a light on hidden agendas. And in my garage, the only intruder I've caught on camera lately is a stray cat searching for warmth. That's just fine by me.